I'm Blues, and I'd like to welcome you to my REH Hot Licks video. And what we're going to be doing today is covering a bunch of different things ranging from bending to vibrato to phrasing to equipment to everything else in between. So what we'll do is begin. I'm tuned to E flat, so you may want to start tuning up with me here, and we'll start with an A. Okay. There's a couple different things I'd like to cover. First thing I'd like to point out is I'm going to show you the ways that I do things and the ways that kind of works for me. But let's keep one thing in mind, which is I don't really believe there is a right or wrong way, just simply a way to get the desired result that you'd like. So with that in mind, I'm going to show you my way and my approach to the guitar and kind of how I learned and the right and wrong things that I do. And it's ultimately going to be up to you to kind of take this knowledge and make it into your own thing. Like I said, as long as you get the end result, that's all that really matters. The first thing I would like to cover, we're going to start slow and kind of build up, would be bending. I think bending is very important because what it does is it takes your vocabulary of notes and it ultimately really kind of helps it grow a lot. By taking the same notes and bending them, you're kind of getting a lot more with what you're doing. And now we can start with the simplest stuff, which I believe are like the 2-fret bend, which is the standard stuff that most blues players do. For example, let's say we're playing in D, which would be I believe most players kind of do a 2-fret bend, which is kind of like, ultimately what you're doing is taking a note and bending it up 2 frets. And what I'm doing is working with a very simple, basic, kind of like a pentatonic type scale, which is the first scale that I learned. And so I'll kind of work with that one a little bit. For example, let me show you what we're working with so that you understand where we're going. Probably. Now, I primarily kind of tend to stay with the higher strings just because they're the easier to bend. So, for example, the most common bends that are done, at least you hear in a lot of the bluesy type stuff, is, work with more of the higher strings. For example, like... or kind of... And it's very basic, but what it does is it gives you a very strong foundation to work with. And from there, you can go to the next step, which would ultimately be working with different types of bends to help your vocabulary grow. For example, the most common one, like we stated, would be a 2-fret one, which would be... What I like to work with a little bit differently is taking a 1-fret bend, and it's still basically the same notes, it's just a little different. For example, the note I would come in with would be more of a... So by taking and doing 1/2-fret bends, you're going to ultimately work with the same basic notes, just get a lot more out of it. And by doing that, what it allows you to do is ultimately expand your vocabulary without really changing any notes, kind of like cheating, kind of cool. Another thing I like to work with, which you can also keep in mind, is also working with kind of like not necessarily a full fret or a 2-fret or a 1-fret, kind of working with like a 1/2 fret, which is ultimately something that guys like Beck did, and a lot of players like that. And ultimately, you're taking a note. Let's say this note here would be. You can take it and get more than just You can kind of get everything in between, like a. And by doing that, you can ultimately make your sound a little bit different. For example, I try working a lot with, 1/2 fret and also things in between that are technically not necessarily correct, but kind of work and give your playing a different sound. And you can also overbend. A lot of players do it, and done properly, it can also add a lot to your playing style. For example, kind of like... by taking that note and overbending, once again, it's not necessarily any different notes you're working with, just a different application of bending. Now, I think bending's very important because ultimately what it allows you to do is just, you know, make a standard scale sound a little bit different, which also brings me to the next step, which is kind of like your vibrato. I think the vibrato is very important because it really helps separate a lot of guitar players. I mean, you have to keep in mind that, you know, I mean, a guitar is basically, you know, some frets and 6 or 7 strings, depending on which one you have, and a couple pickups, and you have to realize that all your favorite players sound totally different. And it's not because they have anything special or do anything differently. It's simply a matter of fact that, you know, they take what they do and do it differently. So I think it's kind of up to you to kind of focus on how you're doing what you're doing rather than trying to figure out what everybody else is. For example, I think the vibrato is very important because the same note, you know, vibrato 2 different ways with 2 different sounds, it's like 2 totally different feels. For example, I can take this note here and make it almost like a ballady type feel. Like I can take the same note, use the bridge pickup, you know, and make it more of a rock thing, like, you know. And so ultimately, there's really nothing. The note's not different, it's just how you did it. For example, a lot of the blues players have been doing this lick, you know. You know, you can take that lick, give it a different sound, different vibrato. It's like the lick didn't change any. I mean, it's basically just the way I played it. So keep in mind, it's all at your fingertips. It's simply a matter of you as a player deciding, you know, what comes the most natural and getting your own sound out of it. Also, in regards to vibrato, there's a couple different ways to achieve, you know, getting the vibrato that, you know, you're going to choose to be the one you're going to work with. But also, the whole reason for even working with vibrato and kind of trying to focus in on it is a lot of it kind of started when I first began to play. The very first in the very beginning stages of my practicing, I wasn't really sure of pitch. I had no idea of where to bend the note, and I always used to kind of like overbend, but never intentionally. If I was playing an E, I would kind of come in and kind of bend a little sharp. And it was not quite the desired effect I was looking for. So what I used to do is that by working with the vibrato, I figured if the note was kind of somewhere in the middle, and I bent between here and there, I knew it was in there somewhere. And that's ultimately how I originally kind of came up with that really wide. And that's ultimately how I developed it, by working with kind of covering myself. So that's how I developed a wide vibrato, and that's why I use, you know, for my playing style. And some exercises to work with depends on, you know, how you want to achieve your vibrato. A lot of players do it differently. A lot of players pull down on the string, for example. A lot of players push up. I mean, you're ultimately, you know, as long as you're using just your fingers, you're ultimately just taking the note and bending it sharp. You can do the sideways vibrato, which a lot of the classical players do tend to favor just because of the nylon string, you know, don't tend to give as much as the steel strings. But ultimately, that's going to be up to you and how you decide to get the, you know, the best effect you're looking for. What I do is I typically tend to want to use my fingers, and as far as exercises, what I kind of did is that it was just a matter of building up the strength in my hand. So what I would do is take a guitar and string it with heavier strings. For example, these are 10s, 10 through 38, and I would use, on the practice guitar I had for working my finger strength up, I would put like 11 through like a 56. Sounded great, but it was just miserable to play because I was used to playing, you know, the guitar set up for different types of music. So ultimately what I would do is I would try and play and work. I would just sometimes sit at home with like the TV turned off and just sitting there working on the strings. And what it ultimately did is it's kind of like lifting weights with your fingers a little bit. And also when you went back on a lighter string guitar, you could fly all over the guitar, which kind of was pretty cool. And so these are things I think you can kind of work with in order to help, you know, hone your vibrato chops up. And like I said, I use my fingers, and a lot of my sound comes from my right hand versus my my left hand versus my right hand, just due to the fact that I tend to get a lot of my sound, you know. All my sound pretty much seems to come much more from my left hand, just because it's kind of the way I've developed my style. I tend to not rely on as much of my picking hand as possible. And like I said, I use my fingers, so you're ultimately always pulling the notes sharp. You may want to consider using your whammy bar if you do have one. Like I said, typically on most guitars you tend to go flat with the whammy bar, for example, and it gives it a different effect. For example, if I take this note here with my fingers, I tend to pull it sharp. If I used a whammy bar set up on most guitars, you tend to go flat. So I tend not to use my whammy bar because it's kind of, I've just developed working with my fingers, and it's also I can't get as much of a response out of it, especially on the higher strings. And if I tend to use the bar, it kind of gives it a different feel altogether. So I tend to kind of favor the hands for sure. You can pull sharp with the whammy bar if you choose to. For example, a lot of effects are, to give it a different effect. I tend probably not to favor that as much, with the exception of pulling up on harmonics like The next thing I'd like to touch base on is something that's probably the most important and also kind of the hardest to teach, just due to the fact that it's something that becomes a very personal thing, which is ultimately your phrasing. And the licks you're playing are ultimately only as good as they're kind of set up to be. For example, if you're playing on a fast song, everybody expects you to play fast. Try playing slow, because it's something that's a little bit unexpected, and it tends to give kind of the listener, something to latch onto per se, rather than trying to, beat the masses. So a lot of the phrasing, like I said, is going to have to do with your rhythm and the way you phrase stuff. I learned a lot from watching drummers play. From watching drummers, I realized they only had a certain amount of things to hit, yet they could play extended periods of time without repeating themselves. So I like to kind of, work with setting up the lick. For example, like I said, playing on a faster song, people are going to expect you to play fast. Try playing slow. Also, try letting the phrase breathe. For example, a lot of players are so content on just trying to shove everything into there, and a lot of times what you end up doing is kind of shooting yourself in the foot, ultimately, because you're trying to outdo yourself. And if you give people too much of a good thing, ultimately what they do is kind of just lump it all together, and it's expected of you. So what you can do to kind of save yourself a little bit of trouble is when you're playing, try purposely kicking back and try letting the note do the work per se, or letting the phrase do the work. If I'm playing in E, and everybody expects me to be, if I'm playing over, let's say, a standard progression, kind of like I think a lot of people are going to expect me to come in and go, save yourself a time. If you're playing over this progression, okay, and I think what you should also try doing a lot of times, and I kind of do this a lot, almost by using my fingers, is that when you're working on your phrasing, try incorporating a little bit of rhythm into it. As far as the phrasing goes, if you take your, kind of give your lead playing a little bit of rhythm work, ultimately what you can do is give the listener kind of something to latch onto. So it's definitely something to try and incorporate into your lead playing, rather than going out and trying to kill the person. Let the notes breathe. There's nothing wrong with an extended vibrato, And for example, a good way of doing this is a lot of times I'll try and shuffle stuff, and it kind of helps give a fairly decent feel to what I'm doing, rather than just kind of cranking out standard licks. By throwing kind of a shuffly feel into it, if you're playing over a shuffle, it really helps. It's kind of like okay, and ultimately, to sum up phrasing as best I can, I hate to tell you this, but ultimately the only way you're really going to get your own sound is you kind of have to put in the time and practice up and get your own thing. It's something that you kind of have to figure out on your own, because it's such an individual thing. I mean, players, for example, like Richie Blackmore, I really liked his phrasing. I thought it was a very unique way of phrasing, and no matter how hard I tried to copy it, I just never could, because it was always his own unique thing. And so the reality is it's something you really have to develop on your own and put the most time in. But it's something to definitely be conscientious of, because it really helps define your sound as an individual player. One thing I like to work with a lot are my fingers. I like to work with my fingers more so than a lot of other players, just because what it allows me to do is get a different sound, almost like a more percussive effect that you couldn't get with the pick, you know. And I think by combining the two, you can ultimately kind of come up with something that's really cool. The pick is definitely, you can play very fast with the pick, and it definitely helps for hitting things dead on for that you don't really get to do with your fingers, but your fingers can work great for doing different things. For example, incorporating a bass line into your playing. I do that. The new song on the Hair Pick, the Hair Pick album, which is my third solo record. If you listen to the rhythm track of it, you'll notice there's always a bass line going throughout the whole thing. It's kind of and by working with your fingers, you just get a different sound. It's almost more of a kind of a personal sound, and you know. As far as another reason for using my fingers is that also greatly helps me in working with dynamics. And I think dynamics is something that's very important, because ultimately if you come out on 10 and you play on 10 the whole night, by the time the show's over, it's considered to be a fairly boring show, which is sad but true. So with that in mind, it helps to kind of give a little bit of variation. For example, if you're doing a ballad song and then you come cranking out with a lead that's very loud and very over the top, it makes much more of an impression, rather than if it were on a much crazier, heavier song. So these are things I like to work with, and I think my fingers, because it tends to give me a little bit more control over the note, really seems to help, especially for chords and stuff like As far as dynamics, you can always rely on your equipment. For example, now I don't particularly do this, and we'll get into this a little bit later with the equipment, but certain players use different kinds of, different presets and patches if they have this, foot switchable stuff. You can rely on your equipment as far as getting different types of dynamics. I tend not to, because the only true common factor in any of the gigs I've ever played is that nothing ever really works. So with that in mind, I've tried to keep things really basically as simple as possible, and always kind of relied way more on myself than I have on of any of my equipment. But like I said, some people can turn down the volume knob, some people switch to, have single coil pickups and switch from humbuckers to single coils, and that also helps kind of drop stuff down, but I typically tend to shy away from that just due to the fact that it never really works for me. So with that in mind, that's just yet another way you can also work with dynamics and things like that. Now, as far as other things, which is a big factor of it, is the equipment, and I think it's something that needs to be covered. far as equipment, I mean, here's the basic rule. I mean, there really is no basic rule, and it gets down to this. Ultimately, what is truly going to work for yourself? And that's really the bottom line as far as anything else. What works for me may not work for you, and what works for the person next to you may not work for me. So with that in mind, it's basically a very expensive trial and error period if you really haven't discovered your sound. For example, I knew ultimately that I wanted to, I knew the basic sound I was going for. I wanted a, fairly distorted sound that was pretty easy to play, but at the same time I wanted it clean so that you could hear the difference between all the chords. For example, if I do, if I'm playing a chord and I drop down a note, I want to be able to hear it. I wanted something that was very crunchy and yet clean for rhythms, but at the same time had the punch and was able to get through with the leads, and that was also something that was important. Kind of wanted the best of both worlds. Now, not only did I want it to kick through with the leads, kind of like... And not only did I want it to cut through with the leads, but I also wanted to be very smooth at times, yet very abrasive at other times. For example, I wanted to be punchy enough to cut through for a rhythm thing, so it's kind of like... But at the same time, I wanted it to be ultra smooth, and I wanted a very kind of smooth, warm neck pickup sound. And at the same time, I had to kind of find a way to, when I turned to sit up down, I also wanted it to go clean. So as you can see, I don't rely on anything else with the exception of what I have at my hands. And just out of pure necessity, it works best for me. So the way I kind of figured out was, first I had to figure out what kind of guitar I wanted to play, and that brings me to my guitar. The guitar I'm playing is a Samick, and it's a brand new guitar that I pretty much custom made by myself. What I did is I sat at home and drew out exactly what I wanted, and this is actually a prototype, and the model, there is going to be a series actually of guitars coming out, and it's a little bit different than this one. It's got an extended piece here, and it's got a couple body contours, but this is the very, very first prototype. And basically what it is the body's made out of alder, which is a pretty warm, pretty smooth wood that works really good for, what I wanted. The neck is made out of maple, and I wanted it for the bite. It kind of really helps, especially for chording. I use very big frets, huge frets, like jumbo frets, pretty much. And the reason being is because so much of my sound comes from my left hand anyway, so I figured, it just makes it a lot easier to bend. I remember like 10 years ago when when I first started playing, they had guitars with really small frets, so it's really hard to bend. So I've got pretty big, almost like Jim Dunlop 6100s on here. I use 2 humbuckers, and I've just always pretty much used it. I've experimented with single coils, and it never really worked for the type of sound that I wanted to go for, which was a pretty straightforward rock and roll sound. And ultimately, I'm running 2 humbuckers. They're Seymour Duncan pickups, and what it is, it's a custom model pickup that I have out. It's called a blues trembucker, and it's wound very close to a PAF, and it keeps the guitar very natural and clean sounding. And that's something that really helps a lot, because if you have a totally distorted sound coming from your guitar, it's hard to get anything clean out of it, whereas it's a lot easier to make it more distorted. So that's how I kind of came about with that. Like I said, I have 1 volume knob and a 3-way switch, and it's pretty much wired bridge, and then neck, because if you watch, ultimately, I'm always switching between these 2 pickups, especially even in between a lot of licks. I'll start off with the bridge pickup, and I'll kind of start very high on the bridge pickup, work my notes lower, end up on the neck pickup, and what it kind of does, it just almost makes it a greater array of kind of what I'm doing, and it also freaks the sound man out a lot, so it's pretty cool to do. Another thing about it is that, like I said, I've got a Floyd on this guitar because my style is just kind of revolved around playing with tremolos. I like them because it allows me to kind of overcompensate for things working with the tremolo. A lot of disadvantages to working with the tremolo also, because it'll, you can't do a lot of the bending. It makes the strings go flat a lot of times, but you find ways of compensating for that. Sometimes I rest my hand on the bridge. Sometimes, I will just play around it almost, and so that's a big part of it. And ultimately, all I really do is run my guitar straight into my amplifier, which is back there. The amp's a pretty special thing, and that has a lot to do with my sound. And I think a lot of people don't realize that ultimately you are totally, completely, and truly influenced by your sound. For example, if somebody gave me a telly through a clean amp, realistically I'd probably play a lot differently than I do now. And so, which also works well, because a lot of times in the writing process, by working with different different pieces of equipment allows me to write different songs, and so I kind of get inspired by different guitars and different pieces of equipment because it throws you in a different mood and allows you to play differently. But ultimately, the amp is a pretty special thing. It's an amp that my father actually custom made for me. It's a Dirty Boy amplifier. It's one of a kind, and basically the story behind the amp, it's a very simple principle that's kind of been taken to the farthest region of what we could do. I always liked distortion, but I always used to use older amps where I would turn them up and let the power section really work, more so than the preamps. Everybody today has got these huge racks with all these preamps and stuff, and that's how they get their sound. Mine's pretty much backwards. I get my sound mostly from the power amp, and the preamp has less to do with it. So ultimately, what you'll see on the back of that amp, if you can zoom up on it, is that there's a big knob, and what that knob ultimately does is control the voltage, but in a much different way than a standard Variac controls it. I guess your regular amplifier, a lot of people take their amp, plug it into a Variac, and try and achieve the same sound, and the amp was designed that only certain part of the amps work on that control, and it's basically a very complex thing that ultimately just allows the guitar to sound great. You'll notice I've got it down to about 40, which means I'm probably running at about, I don't know, maybe 60 volts right now, but the amp is excruciatingly loud, and it's also probably the most versatile amp I've ever worked with. So especially on my third solo record, Hair Pick, you'll definitely be hearing the amplifier. And like I said, this is the stuff that I use, and the reason why I use it, you know, is pretty much very simple. It's my trial and error has pretty much led me to kind of work with that. I know that in a clinch, you know, situation where everything is failing, these two things always come out the same. I like really big necks on guitars, and I like amplifiers that are really loud and pretty clean yet distorted enough to really rock out. So and that's what my experience has led me to believe. The best advice I could ever give you is, realistically, you're going to have to pretty much go through that process yourself and decide whether you're going to work with single coils or, you know, humbuckers, or where you want to place it. And like I said, just keep in mind that there is no rule. The most expensive guitar is not, by far, not necessarily the best guitar for you. You have to decide ultimately what's going to work best for you. Actually, another topic that I'm very often asked about is practicing and exercises. Well, I don't really practice much, so I can't really tell you much about that, but I can tell you about exercises, because at one time I did do some. So with that in mind, the exercises I used to do were pretty much simple. My biggest thing is I wanted to get my right hand up to par, because I think that was what was the most impressive, even though all my sound seems to come from my left hand. What I would do is ultimately take a pattern, it could be any pattern, and I would just start slow and ultimately build it up. I would try and take a hard pattern that was very hard to me and try and get it not necessarily fast but clean. I was more into being a clean player than I was a fast player, because everybody around me was really fast and not very clean. So with that in mind, I took a simple pattern, kind of like well, I mean, something like a 1-3-5 spread, ultimately like and what I would do is kind of take that and ultimately move it up and down the neck, kind of like a... Then I would take it, you know... And then I would just keep slowly but surely moving it up. And like I said, that's something that'll come basically just through repetition. Best thing I can tell you about exercising is don't try and do anything too fast, too quick, because ultimately it never works out. So take an exercise and basically start slow, and it can be any pattern. For example, a lot of people, the one I like to work with a lot is just something I made up, and it's not necessarily a musical thing as much as it's just an exercise thing. Like I said, as far as picking goes, you could try starting slow and building up, for example, on a tremolo thing, which is a pretty standard thing. You can kind of... Okay, another exercise that I try working with is I try taking a pattern and then I try and work it into more of a musical thing. And it's not necessarily to play it as fast as you can, it's just something that kind of ultimately worked out to actually be a part in the song. If you listen to the first track on the Hairpick record, on the song Stinky Kitty, it's got a part that was originally just an exercise, and I ended up turning it into part of the song, like this. A lot of people always pointed out the fact that I did point the pick and that the pick is shaved. The pick part I saw another player play, and I really liked the way that person played, so ultimately I took and filed the pick, and I tried playing with it, and it was terrible. I was like, this totally sucks. Why would anyone want to file their pick? And I tried it for about 2 days. I figured, let me at least give myself enough time to fully try and make it happen. I couldn't get it to work for me, so I went to go back to a regular shaped pick, and I hated it. It was like worse than I've ever played, so I've just kind of gotten almost like addicted to playing with the point. And ultimately what it really does is it makes it harder to play, if you can believe that or not, but which is fine, because when you're out in front of people and you're playing, and if the guitar is too easy to play, I fall over it sometimes. Sometimes I need a guitar, that's why I keep the action so high on it, and that's why I keep my pick pretty pointed, because it just makes it a little bit ultimately harder to play. And also another thing is people always point out the angle of the way I pick, and it just came about because every player had a different feel. Van Halen would come up and he would just kind of hit over the top of it. And there were other players that would kind of pick in circles. And the only way I could really ever get anything the fastest I could possibly pick is when I did the tremolo thing and when I kept my hand pretty rigid. So therefore, it's kind of how I developed this really weird way to play, and I can't, once again, you just fall into a groove, and it's not necessarily the correct way, but it just kind of works for you. And it's the most, it's the way I could play the fastest one I wanted to, but at the same time, because I would hit the guitar so hard, a lot of people don't realize it, but if, I'm just hitting the strings so hard when I'm playing, because I typically used to not really play with a lot of gain or a lot of anything but pure volume, and you'd always have to really hit the guitar as hard as you could to get it to work for you. So that's ultimately how I came out with it, and I really think as long as you position your right hand somewhere, it really helps. Some people position it up here on the guitar. Some people, put their fingers out and use their palm. But ultimately, because I had a tremolo on the guitar, I could never rest my palm on it. Otherwise, it would get... I always had really bad tuning problems. So ultimately, what I would do is position my hand either with this finger or my middle finger, and I would pick everything around it, and it just kind of helped. If I wasn't, really coming down on it, I would position my hand. So, and I wasn't even aware of that till I saw a picture of myself playing, because these are things you just develop without even realizing it. You'll also notice I keep my thumb over the guitar a lot, and I tend not to use my pinky, which everybody painfully points out to me. I do use it, but I use it more on the, on the arpeggiated stuff, because that's ultimately where my pick, it's where I kind of needed it for the stretching. Because I have fairly, large size hands, it made it, I could always compensate with moving this finger over, which kind of formed a bad habit. But ultimately, I just picked it up, and I picked using my thumb over it because I was always bending so much, and I wanted to get to strength. The only problem with keeping your thumb behind the neck perfectly is, one, when you stand up, your guitar is so much lower that you don't seem to have as much strength, and you can't have quite as much control over bending the notes. And because I really like to really have a pretty wide vibrato, because I, pretty much played like that, I always kept my thumb over it. And it was really good because when I was doing a lot of the bluesier stuff, it really worked out for me. And it also kind of helped when I was doing a lot of, when I would try and get percussive with my playing, I kept my thumb over it because it also helped me mute a lot of the strings. You also notice when I'm doing a lot of that stuff, it's all downstrokes with the pick. When I'm doing a lot of... And as far as other exercises, you'll notice everything we've kind of worked with today on this tape, I've tried to keep as close to a pentatonic scale as I can, because ultimately, to give people too much, it one shot kind of sometimes works against you. So with that in mind, there's other things you can work with. Like I said, keep in mind everything we've done has been basically really close to the pentatonic, almost that blues boxy scale. Now, in order to get away from that, what you ultimately have to do is find different scales that are going to work for you. And the problem is that scale. Now, you can add a couple things to that. For example, I like to take this part down here, and it's just more stuff you're adding. And what I'll also try and do is add kind of almost like an, almost part of an Allman Brothers-y type thing, and that scale is more that. And what that allows me to do is kind of play differently. Rather than playing up and down, it allows me to play a little bit more sideways, kind of like. Now, there's also other things I work with, stuff like this. That is more of an arpeggiated thing that you kind of want to, is more, I think, a signature sound. It doesn't necessarily work for as much, but I find between working with kind of a pentatonic thing and kind of stepping out and doing more of this, you know, more of the Allman Brothers-y type scale, it really helps a lot as far as my playing because it allows me to do more. And what that was is a lot of that just kind of came from a lot of the arpeggiated school. I mean, when the Bach rock type thing was kind of in, it was something that you just developed, and it was originally started as exercises down the neck, like and what it was is it just kind of seemed to be more signature. For example, it was very kind of Randy Rhoads-esque type influence, and it was very cool to use, but as soon as I did it, it immediately took the whole piece and kind of threw it in that direction. So it's the type of thing that you want to have in your vocabulary to kind of step out a little bit, but at the same time, you don't want to be able, you know, to kind of revolve around it because then you're kind of locked into it. So it's something to work on. And there's other parts of it, for example, a lot of, which I did a lot. I tried finding ways of making the whole thing kind of weave into my style, which was an example like this one here. All right, what we're going to do now is I'm going to play a song off my third solo record, which is entitled Hairpick, and this song's called Rabbit Soup. Another topic that's often brought up is two-handed tapping or finger tapping, whatever it's called these days. And I think an interesting way to make this incorporate into your style is ultimately doing something and making something that sounds cool and not necessarily red flagging and letting people know that you're doing a two-handed thing. For example, when Van Halen came out and he did that, you know, the two-handed thing that he did, I mean, every kid in America was doing it and that was a great thing, but it also kind of gotten done to death. So with that in mind, I really liked the approach of it. I just didn't like the redundancy of it because it had already been done. So with that in mind, I tried to find ways to bring it to the next step and kind of make it almost part of a song. For example, if you listen to my first record, which is Never Look Back, on one of the songs there, it's actually a rhythm part, and it kind of goes something like this. Now a slower one would be okay, obviously with that one, what you'll notice is that the song's in G, so the open strings I can work with are pretty much all. And that works well. So by trying to keep the open string rolling, what it does is it becomes part of the song rather than a solo piece. And by doing that, it allows me to keep an open string. And I always recommend working with open strings because it's something that gives you one more option. For example, if you're playing an A, the one thing I try and do with the wah pedal that's kind of a little bit different than other people is I try and use it more for a tone pop. And it's just, once again, because I only use a volume and a bridge and a neck pickup, it really helps me kind of ultimately get more out of the guitar, kind of like another effect that I do sometimes when playing, especially on the records more so than live, just because it lends itself better to the studio, is the effect I do with the delay, which is ultimately goes something like this. And if I did it without the delay, it would ultimately sound like this. Another effect that I did with the delay, which I did on my first two records, which was Never Look Back and the Plaid record, rather than hitting the delay in the string strictly with a pick and using a very hard delay, what I did is I used the volume and I kind of swelled them in, and ultimately rather than hearing, you heard, and the lick kind of goes something like this. Now, if I played that, once again, like the other lick, if I play it without the actual delay, it sounds like it. Okay, another thing that I also should point out is that I am using a quad reverb, which is basically just a reverb unit, and I have it through my effects loop so that I don't really pick up that much noise, and ultimately all it's used for is strictly reverb, so that I have a little bit of kind of like a little bit of a room sound after each note. If I played a note really tight, it would sound like this. And I just use it because ultimately it kind of gives it more, a little bit of a depth and allows me a little bit more leeway as far as playing, makes the guitar a little bit more comfortable to play. And also, because I have the voltage turned so far down in the amp, it also makes the amp a little bit spongier and allows me to make the chords really sizzle out, kind of like best way you could really learn how to play and do anything like that is ultimately to go out and do it. You can sit in your room and become great, and then you'll be in front of people and you'll freak out and freeze and stuff, and it's just part of the whole learning process. The best way to do it, the best advice I could ever give you is just to go out and do it, and don't worry about being correct, and don't worry about holding your pick the right way, and don't worry about having perfect posture. Worry about going out and, you know, and having fun and getting the sound you want. That's the bottom line. There really is. As much as I want to, you know, say there's a right or wrong way, there isn't. My favorite players, once I've met them and talked to them, they did everything totally backwards, and it always worked. So with that in mind, you know, it's something to keep in mind as you're learning. As far as influences stuff, it's pretty wide-ranging, and just because I like a lot of stuff. But ultimately, as far as when I first started playing, I liked a lot of the rock stuff. I'm definitely not a jazz guy, and I'm not a swing, you know, person. I'm definitely into the rock and roll, the real straightforward, you know, stuff. Is originally what I was into. When I was younger, I liked, you know, Chuck Berry and Johnny Winter, because these guys really got out there. And I mean, they just got out there and cranked. You know, like when you hear the, you know, the Johnny Be Good live from Johnny Winter, I mean, you could tell it was a bunch of guys just going totally crazy on stage, and I was definitely down with that. And then as I got older, I started getting into more and more accomplished players. Like I said, I liked people that were really distinctive. For example, I liked Brian May because he had his own unique sound, and I liked that. I really respect the fact that he didn't sound like anybody else. I liked Richie Blackmore, and just players like that, you know. And then I got into Van Halen because he just hit at such, you know, he was just so big when he hit that helped fuel a lot of stuff. And I also worked at a music store when I was like 11. From 11 to like 16, I worked like 1 day a week on a Saturday when I wasn't in school. And then that was really good for me because it gave me a chance to kind of see all the other local players and keep an eye on exactly what was going on around me. And so it helped me. Even though no one showed me really anything per se, I still learned a lot because I watched everybody else, and so I was pretty into that. And that was really a lot of the formative years, and I started practicing pretty seriously when I was like 13. So from 13 to like 15, I really actually sat down and practiced, and I haven't practiced since then, actually, which is sad but true. And just because now I'm more into you know, now that I've done the records, and I think I've kind of got I've got 3 records out now, and I've kind of definitely shown a lot of, you know, what I'm about and the style that I'm, you know, working towards, and so on and so forth. That I think now it's more, guitar for me is more about, you know, doing different things, keeping myself interested as far as coming up with new material and writing different stuff, and that's kind of where it's turned into right now, and that's ultimately where I'm at the moment. All right then, well, basically I think these are a lot of things that can kind of help you on your way to developing your own style, and hopefully this will inspire you to create some really new cool music. So with